Welcome back to my channel, where we uncover the forgotten corners of the past. Today, I'm taking you into a story about a forgotten logging camp in 1875 and the horrifying secret of why, out of 121 men, only 9 walked out alive. A story that you might have never heard before. A mystery buried in the dust of time. A truth that will send shivers down your spine. But before we embark on this journey, take a moment to let me know where are you listening to this story from. That helps me understand how far these secrets have traveled. And if this story truly captivates you, if it makes you ponder, don't hesitate to give me a like and subscribe to the channel to keep me going. Together, we'll explore the darkest pages of history, and you won't want to miss a thing. History is not always written in ink on paper. Sometimes it is carved into the ice by silence, sealed by fear, and retold only in forgotten whispers. Our story today begins not with a bang, but with a simple ledger, a grim arithmetic that no official logbook would ever dare to record. In the early winter of 1875, the North Pine Timber Company was a name synonymous with progress and prosperity. Their posters, plastered in the gritty port towns of the Pacific Northwest, promised not just a job, but an adventure, a chance for hard-working men to tame the vast Alaskan wilderness and earn a wage that could change their families' fortunes. 121 men answered that call. They were loggers, miners, failed farmers, and veterans of forgotten wars, all drawn by the lure of a winter's pay that promised to be more than they could make in a year. They walked into a promising valley named North Pine Basin, their shoulders broad and their hearts full of a rugged American optimism. But when spring arrived and the snows thawed, only 9 of them walked out. 9 gaunt figures, haunted and hollowed, carrying a secret far heavier and colder than any log they had ever shouldered. Among those who answered the company's call was one who did not fit the mold. His name was Elias Vaughn, a 27-year-old man from Boston whose hands were pale and slender, more accustomed to the smooth caress of paper than the splintered grain of an axe handle. He was bookish by nature, a man who found comfort in the predictable world of numbers and letters. He had taken the job as camp clerk to escape the suffocating propriety of his life back east, and, perhaps, to outrun a quiet grief that the city's noise could no longer drown out. His job, as defined by his contract, was to be the bastion of order amidst the chaos of the frontier. He was to track every cord of spruce, every barrel of salted pork, every yard of rope. He was the man behind the ink, a silent witness tasked with translating the raw, brutal effort of men into the clean, sterile language of profit and loss. Elias was not a hero, at least not in the conventional sense. He was merely a record keeper, a steadfast believer in the unassailable logic of his ledgers, until that very logic was systematically dismantled and reassembled into something monstrous, a horrifying new system of accounting, seemingly drafted in the darkest corners of hell. What then could possibly erase over 100 men from existence in a single winter, leaving almost no trace? A sudden, catastrophic blizzard, a pack of starving wolves? Or was it something far more primal and insidious? A hunger born not just of the stomach, but one that lurked dormant within their own nature, waiting patiently for the perfect, suffocating isolation to awaken. Their new world, Camp 17, was less a camp and more a wound carved into the flesh of the earth. A frozen scar deep within the endless taiga forest. The journey itself was a brutal crucible designed to sever them from the world they knew. For 6 days on foot, they trudged through ice-locked valleys where the wind howled like a banshee. stealing the warmth from their bones and the resolve from their hearts. The towering pines rose around them like the bars of a cage, their dark boughs heavy with snow, muffling all sound and sealing them into a world made only of bark, shadow, and the unnerving, profound silence. Here, silence was not peace. It was an oppressive, physical weight. It was the emptiness of a godless cathedral, a void that swallowed every cough, every curse, every muttered prayer, leaving only the percussive crack of an axe against timber and the mournful shriek of the wind through the chinks of their crude cabins. Camp 17 was a closed system, its own planet operating under its own grim physics. A remote domain far beyond the reach and the concern of the civilized world's laws. The foreman who presided over this isolated kingdom was a man named Grant Harker. He was a former military man, stern and imposing, with eyes the color of a winter sky. He spoke little, but his presence was a constant, unspoken pressure upon the men. He was a devout believer in order and efficiency, a man who saw the forest not as a living entity, but as a standing inventory of resources to be liquidated. The social fabric within this theater of isolation was as thin and fragile as a sheet of ice over deep water. The men were a collection of strangers, displaced and disconnected, tall, blonde Swedes who kept to themselves, quiet Finns with superstition in their eyes, rugged Scotsmen whose laughter was loud but short-lived, and a few Americans from the Midwest, perpetually nursing grievances. They had no families here, no community, nothing to bind them together but a shared contract and a shared, gnawing sense of unease. They had come for the promise of prosperity, but they had traded their autonomy to enter a realm where the rules of society began to feel like a distant memory. The initial camaraderie, forged over shared whiskey and boastful card games, quickly became a relic of a more hopeful time as the cold, the hunger, and Harker's iron-fisted rule began their relentless siege. And in the heart of this volatile ecosystem, Elias Vaughan worked each morning in the relative quiet of his small office cabin. He would light his kerosene lamp, the flickering flame a tiny sun against the encroaching darkness. He meticulously recorded every detail, his pen scratching against the paper in a steady rhythm. For Elias, these ledgers were more than just records. They were a shield, a testament to order and reason in a world that seemed to defy both. He believed that as long as the numbers balanced, as long as every asset and every debit was accounted for, their small world remained stable. But it was this very obsession with detail, this unwavering faith in the integrity of his numbers, that made him the first to feel the tremor, the first to notice the hairline cracks appearing in the foundation of his logical fortress. The first portent of the horror to come was not a scream in the night or a splash of blood on the snow. It was a subtle, almost insignificant discrepancy in the food ledger. The reserves of salted meat and flour were diminishing at a rate that simply did not align with the number of mouths to feed. At first, Elias attributed it to a clerical error, perhaps even to pilfering rats. He spent 2 days recounting, but the numbers remained stubbornly inconsistent. Then, after the first logger, a quiet Swede named Lars was reported lost on a scouting mission. A strange and unsettling event occurred. The camp's rations, which should have been stretched thinner, suddenly became plentiful. The stew pots in the mess hall were steaming and full, brimming with the dark, rich meat that none of the men recognized. And for the first time in weeks, they ate until they were satisfied. In his kitchen log, Elias noted the sudden, unexplained increase of fresh protein supply, but there was no corresponding entry of a successful hunt. No record of a deer or moose being brought into camp. That single illogical entry drew Elias's reluctant attention to Braddock, the camp cook. Braddock was a mountain of a man, with thick, calloused hands and a perpetual, greasy smile that never, ever reached his cold, vacant eyes. He was a creature of routine and silence, communicating only through guttural grunts and dismissive nods. When he ladled out the new stew, his smile seemed to widen by a fraction, holding a cryptic, almost proprietary satisfaction. And on the nights that followed a man's disappearance, the loggers bunking nearest the kitchen would lie awake, listening to a steady, unnerving sound that sliced through the forest's silence until the bleak light of dawn. It was the sound of Braddock sharpening his knives. A rhythmic, metallic scrape of steel on whetstone, a grim, methodical lullaby for the growing number of empty bunks that would never again be filled. The methodical scraping of steel on stone became the new, unholy heartbeat of Camp 17, a grim metronome marking the passage of time not in hours, but in disappearances, the inciting incident that shattered the camp's fragile, unspoken truce of denial was not a grand catastrophe, but a mundane, brutal accident that played out under the indifferent gaze of the towering pines. A young Scotsman named MacLeod, barely 20, with a laugh that had once been the loudest in the mess hall, lost his footing on an icy log. The crack of his tibia snapping was a sound so sharp and unnatural it seemed to tear a hole in the fabric of the forest's silence. Men rushed to his side, their faces etched with a complex mask of pity and a raw, animalistic fear. It was the fear of the herd seeing a member fall, knowing the predators were watching. They started to fashion a makeshift stretcher from their own coats and pine branches, their movements urgent, a desperate display of a humanity they still clung to. But before they could lift him, Foreman Harker's voice cut through the cold air, a blade of sound, sharp and utterly devoid of emotion. "Leave him. Braddock will see to it." The words hung in the air, thick and poisonous. There was no stretcher brought from the infirmary. There was no medical kit. Instead, Braddock emerged from the cookhouse, a lumbering shadow against the white snow. He wiped his hands not on a clean cloth, but on a thick, stiff leather apron so deeply stained with patterns of a dark, rust-like color that its original hue was a mystery. He carried no splints, no bandages, only a length of thick rope coiled over his shoulder. The men who had gathered around the whimpering MacLeod slowly, silently, backed away. Their eyes were wide, their faces pale masks of horror, refusing to meet each other's gaze. They returned to their work, the rhythm of their axes becoming frantic, desperate, as if the sheer volume of noise could drown out the young man's fading pleas. MacLeod's body was never seen again. That evening, however, the stew was particularly rich, flecked with herbs Braddock had never used before, and for the first time, small, savory sausages, glistening with fat, appeared on the breakfast platters. No one spoke of it. No one asked questions. A new, unspoken commandment had been etched into the soul of the camp to see nothing, to say nothing, was to survive. The empty bunks in the cabins were no longer a source of whispered speculation about men who might have given up and fled. They were stuck, wooden monuments to a terrible, silent reaping. This event marked a profound turning point. The quiet in the camp transformed from one of shared hardship into a thick, suffocating blanket of complicity and terror. Elias Vaughan, sequestered in his office, felt the shift in the very air he breathed. He saw it in the way the men now moved through the camp, their shoulders perpetually hunched, their eyes constantly darting towards the cookhouse, towards Harker's cabin, towards the deepening shadows between the trees. He recorded MacLeod's departure in the main ledger with the cold. Official explanation dictated by Harker. Contract terminated due to injury. Sent home via supply train. The lie felt foul on his tongue even as he wrote it, but in his own private journal, hidden beneath a loose floorboard under his cot. He wrote something else, the ink bleeding slightly as his trembling hand paused. MacLeod fell. Braddock came. This morning, the men are eating sausage. It was a simple, terrifying equation, an accounting of the damned. Elias, a man of logic and patterns, began to see the horrifyingly consistent choreography to the disappearances. It was a hunt, conducted with chilling efficiency. A man would be singled out, often for the most minor of infractions, a moment of weakness, a persistent cough, a complaint about the meager rations, or simply a look of defiance in his eyes. Harker would then assign this marked man to a solo task at the farthest, most isolated edge of the logging site, often citing the need for a special survey or clearing a new trail. The man would never return. A few hours later, Harker would calmly, methodically, strike the man's name from the payroll, his pen moving with the steady hand of a bookkeeper balancing accounts. And by nightfall, the chimney of Braddock's kitchen would billow a thick, greasy smoke into the Arctic sky, a funeral pyre disguised as a hearth. The camp was no longer a place of work. It had become a meticulously managed abattoir. And the men were beginning to understand that they were the livestock. The psychological pressure mounted relentlessly, twisting the social fabric of the camp into a grotesque parody of a community. Men, who had once shared stories of their families and dreams of the future, now viewed each other with a predator's calculating gaze. Every cough was a potential weakness, every stumble a sign of impending doom. To survive, one had to project an aura of strength, of unwavering usefulness, and above all, of absolute, unquestioning silence. This pervasive terror was precisely the tool Harker needed to exert the control he craved. He began to formalize the camp's new, brutal hierarchy, cementing the unspoken divisions into a rigid caste system. He selected a small handful of the largest, most ruthless loggers, men like Corley, a hulking brute with dead eyes, Monroe, a wiry, watchful man who moved with a hunter's grace, and Stennis, a sycophant with a cruel streak, and formed what the other men began to call, in hushed, fearful whispers, the inner circle. These chosen few were granted privileges that seemed like royal luxuries in the starved landscape of Camp 17. They received double portions of the fresh meat, their plates piled high while others gnawed on hardtack. They were assigned the least strenuous tasks, often merely overseeing the others. Their hands clean while their brethren's were raw and bleeding. They were moved into a separate, warmer bunkhouse, fortified with extra insulation and positioned strategically close to Harker's own cabin. In return for this elevated status, their loyalty was absolute and vicious. They became Harker's eyes, his ears, and his fists. They patrolled the camp, their faces grim and unreadable, watching, always watching, for any sign of dissent, any whisper of rebellion, any flicker of weakness. Their presence amplified the atmosphere of paranoia tenfold. Now, the threat was not just from the foreman and the cook. It was from the man who had once been your friend, the man now sleeping in the warm bunkhouse, his belly full, his conscience cauterized. The camp was irrevocably fractured, divided into two distinct and unequal classes, the predators and the prey, the eaters and the soon-to-be eaten. Elias, watching this new social order crystallize from the cold solitude of his office, felt a dread so profound it seemed to seep into his very bones. He was not a logger. He was not strong. He was a man of letters, of quiet contemplation, of numbers that were supposed to make sense. In this new world, this brutal reality defined by physical prowess and savage utility, he was a liability. His meticulous record-keeping, once a source of professional pride, now felt like a dangerous, damning obsession. The numbers told a story that could get him killed. The column of missing men, now perfectly, horrifically, matched the column of entries for special provisions in the kitchen's private log. The books balanced, but the equation was one of murder. This escalating horror, this transformation of his world into a charnel house, drove Elias to a point of no return. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him more than any winter wind, that suspicion and circumstantial evidence were not enough. He needed tangible proof, something undeniable that could, if he ever escaped this frozen hell, scream the truth to a world that would surely refuse to believe it. The key, he was certain, lay with Harker. The foreman was too methodical, too organized, a man who lived by the ledger and the rule. He would not run such a complex operation without his own records. The risk of seeking them was immense, a direct path to the cookhouse, but the alternative to sit by, to record the names of the dead, and to wait for his own name to be crossed off the list was unthinkable. One night, during the peak of a blinding snowstorm that rattled the very foundations of the cabins and kept even the inner circle confined to their bunkhouse, Elias made his move. The wind howled a symphony of chaos, a perfect cover. His heart hammered against his ribs. Each beat a deafening drum in the silence of his small cabin. He pulled on his warmest clothes, a ghost in the swirling white, and slipped out into the blizzard. The journey to Harker's cabin, a distance of no more than 50 yards, felt like a treacherous Arctic expedition. Finally, he reached the door. It was unlocked. Inside, the air was still and unnaturally cold. A single lantern on the desk cast long, dancing shadows that writhed on the walls like tormented spirits. On the desk lay the official company ledgers, their green covers neat and orderly, but next to them, partially concealed beneath a stack of topographical maps, was something else. It was a small, handsome journal, bound in rich, red leather, a stark, bloody contrast to the drab, functional books of the company. It felt warm to the touch, as if it held a malevolent life of its own. Elias's hands trembled violently as he reached for it. He opened it, and the world, his world, fell away. It was not a diary of personal thoughts or a confession of a man wrestling with his conscience. It was a logbook of pure, unadulterated, systematized evil, written in Harker's precise, detached, forward-slanting script. The first entry was dated just 3 weeks after their arrival. "The winter will be harder than projected," it read. "Company provisions are insufficient for the projected workforce through April. A new resource management protocol is required to ensure the survival of core assets." What followed was not the ravings of a madman driven by hunger, but the cold, calculated, clinical planning of a monster wearing the mask of a logistician. Harker had systematically evaluated every man in the camp, not as a human being, not even as an employee, but as a unit of sustenance. He had created a grim inventory of his own men, a catalogue of flesh, with chillingly detailed notes. Next to each name were annotations that made Elias's stomach churn. Cochrane M. Strong build, high muscle to fat ratio, prime. Next to another Jensen P. Older, sinewy, best for slow cooking, stews. Next to a young boy who had lied about his age to join the crew. Miller T. Slight frame, low yield, expedite. The secret was not just cannibalism born of desperation. It was a premeditated, meticulously planned, and ruthlessly executed culling. A human farm, established to ensure the survival and comfort of a select few. The journal laid out the entire protocol, the method of selecting candidates based on their perceived weakness or lack of social connection, the carefully manufactured accidents, the efficient butchering process to be handled exclusively by Braddock, and even notes on processing efficiency, yield percentages, and flavor profiles. The sausages, the stews, the strange, rich meat that had kept them from starving it was all there, documented with the same dispassionate clarity Elias used to record cords of wood. The red leather journal was not a confession. It was a business plan, a prospectus for an enterprise of pure horror. As Elias stood there in the dead heart of the storm, the howling wind outside a pale imitation of the tempest raging inside his soul, he finally understood the full, horrifying truth of Camp 17. This was not a descent into chaos. It was the implementation of a new, terrible, and exquisitely logical order. The red leather journal was not merely evidence. It was a testament, a Bible for a new and terrible religion where Grant Harker was the soul. Rational deity and human flesh was the sacrament. The irrefutable proof Elias had desperately sought was not just in the lists of names and the cold accounting of dates. It was in the chilling, almost scientific detachment of the prose. This was the mathematics of the flesh. A cold calculus of survival that stripped men of their names, their faces, their histories, their very humanity, and reduced them to a set of quantifiable assets on a balance sheet of existence. Elias, his mind reeling as if from a physical blow, forced himself to move past the initial wave of nauseating shock and absorb the details, knowing with a terrifying clarity that these details were the only weapons he might ever have. His eyes, burning from the strain and the dim lantern light, traced the formulas Harker had devised, crude, yet terrifyingly effective, calculating the caloric value of a man based on his estimated weight and perceived muscle mass. He saw the grim tables that cross-referenced this data with the camp's dwindling food supplies, projecting with pinpoint accuracy when the next harvest would be necessary to maintain the operational efficiency and morale of the core assets, the inner circle. The pages were filled with a lexicon of horror, a new language designed to sanitize atrocity. Men were not murdered, they were decommissioned. Their bodies were not butchered, they were processed. The act of cannibalism itself was clinically referred to as resource reallocation. It was the sterile, bureaucratic language of a factory manager optimizing a production line, not the frenzied rambling of a madman. And that, Elias realized, was the most terrifying part. Harker had not descended into madness. He had ascended to a new, monstrous form of logic. He had created a closed system, a perfectly rational, self-sustaining ecosystem of predation. And this journal was its operating manual. Elias's eyes scanned the pages, his mind branding the words, the names, the numbers into his memory as if with a hot iron. Then he saw it, near the back of the journal, on a page titled Contingency Assets and Potential Liabilities, was his own name, Elias Vaughan. Next to it, Harker had written a single chilling annotation in his neat, forward-slanting script: intelligent but not physically robust, low yield, possesses the capacity for independent analysis, making him a potential vector for morale disruption. Prioritize for decommissioning if dissent is suspected. He was not just a future meal. He was a problem to be managed, a variable to be eliminated from the equation. A floorboard creaked behind him. The sound was soft, almost imperceptible against the deafening howl of the blizzard outside, but in the taut, frozen silence of the cabin, it was as loud and final as a gunshot. Elias froze, every muscle in his body locking, his blood turning to a sluggish, cold sludge in his veins. The red journal was still clutched in his hand, a weight that seemed to anchor him to the spot. He turned, slowly, mechanically, his neck stiff with terror. Grant Harker stood in the doorway, a lantern held aloft in one hand, his face a calm, unreadable mask of shadow and flickering light. He was not angry. He was not surprised. His eyes, the color of chipped slate, flicked from Elias's terrified face down to the damning journal, and then back up. A flicker of something that might have been disappointment, or perhaps just cold, intellectual assessment, crossed his features. The moment stretched into an eternity. The only sounds the frantic, panicked drumming of Elias's heart and the screaming of the wind. A Greek chorus to their private tragedy. "I see you've been reviewing my private accounts, Mr. Vaughn," Harker said. His voice was as calm and level as if he'd found Elias reading a routine company supply manifest. He stepped into the room, a predator entering his den, and closed the door behind him. The click of the latch was a sound of absolute finality, plunging them into a shared, intimate bubble of lamplight and impending violence. "I trust you find my bookkeeping to be in order." Elias couldn't speak. His throat was a knot of raw terror. Words were useless things now. He could only hold up the journal, a silent, trembling accusation. Harker's lips curved into something that was not a smile. It was a look of profound, intellectual satisfaction, the quiet pride of a master craftsman whose complex, controversial work is finally being appreciated by a discerning peer. "Ah, the protocol," he said, nodding slowly as if in recognition of an old friend. "A necessity, I assure you, an unfortunate but entirely logical solution to a logistical crisis. When faced with the certainty of extinction, the herd must be thinned. It is the first and most honest law of nature. A law that civilization, in its arrogance, has tried and failed to paper over with layers of useless sentiment." This was not a confession born of guilt or a plea for understanding. It was a lecture, a sermon from the pulpit of the abyss. Harker stepped closer, his presence seeming to suck the very air from the small cabin, his shadow looming over Elias, a tangible thing of darkness. "Look around you, Mr. Vaughn. Cast aside the romantic notions you brought with you from the city. We are in a world without God, without law, without anything but the snow and the cold and the gnawing hunger in our bellies. The company that sent us here, with their false promises and inadequate supplies, will not save us. They wrote us off as a financial loss the moment the first heavy snow fell. In this world, sentiment is a fatal disease. Morality is a luxury we cannot afford. Survival, pure and simple, is the only virtue." He gestured with a calm, deliberate hand towards the journal, still clutched in Elias's white-knuckled grip. "That book is not a record of murder, as your terrified mind is no doubt telling you. It is a testament to true leadership. It is a document outlining the difficult, necessary decisions that lesser men are too weak, too sentimental to make. I have forged order from the jaws of chaos. I have ensured that the fittest, the most loyal, the most useful, the strongest assets will endure. The men who were decommissioned were already dying. Elias, can't you see that they were succumbing to despair, to frostbite, to the simple, crushing weakness of their own spirits? They had ceased to be productive members of this unit. They had become liabilities. I simply repurposed them into assets. I transformed their inevitable, pointless deaths into a meaningful contribution to the survival of the whole." The sheer, unadulterated sanity of his madness was staggering. Harker was not a rabid animal, frothing at the mouth. He was a philosopher king of his own brutal, snowbound empire, a prophet of a creed built on the altar of ruthless efficiency. He saw the horror and incomprehension on Elias's face, and his expression hardened, a subtle shift from academic detachment to cold command. "You are a man of numbers. Elias, you, of all people, should understand the stark beauty of this logic. This is simply a matter of arithmetic. 121 men cannot survive this winter on the provisions we possess. It is a mathematical impossibility. But 9, perhaps 10, strong, disciplined men can. The equation is simple. The lives of the strong, productive few outweigh the lives of the weak, burdensome many, especially when the many are already lost. I have saved lives. Mr. Vaughan, I have saved my men from the chaos of their own weakness. They weren't your men to save or to spend, Elias finally whispered, his voice a hoarse, broken thing. They were just men. They had names. Harker's cold gaze locked onto him, and for the first time, Elias saw a flicker of genuine anger. That is where you are fundamentally wrong. In Boston, they were just men out here in this place. They are mine. They are my responsibility. They are my crew. And they are my assets. He took another deliberate step forward. Until he was so close, Elias could feel cold radiating from him. And now, Mr. Vaughan, you have ceased to be a useful asset. You have become a liability, a loose entry in the ledger that threatens the integrity of the entire account. So, you have a choice, a simple one. You can be useful again. You can return to your cabin, continue your work, accept the new reality, and eat well. Or you can be repurposed tonight. He let the threat hang in the air, as sharp and cold as an icicle poised to fall. Keep silent. Eat your stew. Be useful. That is the only law here now. Harker turned with military precision and left the cabin. The storm outside swallowing him in an instant, he left Elias alone with the red journal, the copied pages, and the suffocating, absolute knowledge of the truth. The choice he had been given was no choice at all. It was a death sentence, merely deferred. He knew, with a certainty that burned colder than any frost, that his time was now measured in days, perhaps even hours. He could not live within this system of madness. He could not sit in the mess hall and eat the flesh of his comrades, pretending it was just stew. The immediate repercussion of the truth being unveiled was not legal or social. It was personal, primal, and absolute. He had to escape. But he would not go alone, and he would not go empty-handed. The journal was the key. It was the truth. He couldn't risk stealing the original. But his mind, trained for the meticulous retention and duplication of records, went to work. For the next 2 days, Elias lived a terrifying double life. By day, he was the quiet, efficient clerk, his face a carefully constructed mask of numb compliance, his hand steady as he made his entries in the main ledger. By night, fueled by stolen lamp oil and a desperate, burning rage, he transformed. He became a scribe, a historian of atrocity, painstakingly copying the most damning pages of Harker's journal onto spare sheets of ledger paper he managed to conceal. He copied the formulas, the lists of names with their cruel annotations, the chillingly casual descriptions of the process. Each stroke of his pen felt like an act of rebellion, a weapon being forged in the suffocating darkness of his cabin. He knew he couldn't escape on his own. A lone man in the Alaskan wilderness was a dead man. He needed allies. But who could he trust in this den of wolves and terrified sheep? He began to watch the other men, the ones outside the privileged inner circle, scrutinizing them during the brief, silent mealtimes, looking for a flicker of the same soul-crushing horror he felt behind their vacant eyes. He found it in a small group of 8 men who always sat together at the far end of the mess hall. They were a mixed lot, a few older, wiry men and some younger ones who had not yet been hardened by life. They ate little, spoke less, and never, ever looked anyone directly in the eye. They were the other survivors, the ones who had understood, on some deep, primal level, what was happening, and had managed to stay alive thus far through sheer silent terror and by making themselves as unnoticeable as possible. One night, After the final meal, he approached the oldest of them, a grizzled Irish logger named Finn, a man whose face was a roadmap of hard living. In the frozen space between the bunkhouses, with the wind as their only witness, Elias laid out the truth in a hushed, frantic whisper. He didn't have to say much. He just showed Finn a single, copied page from the journal, the page detailing the low yield of a boy they had all known. The old man's face, already weathered and creased, seemed to collapse inward. The horror in his eyes was instantly replaced by a flicker of cold, hard resolve. The others were brought in, one by one, into a conspiracy of whispers held in the dead of night. A pact was made, not with a handshake, but with a shared, desperate glance. They were an alliance of the damned. Their escape was planned for the next major blizzard, their only hope to cover their tracks from Harker's hunters. For a week, they secretly gathered what meager supplies they could, a high-stakes scavenger hunt for survival. They bartered their tobacco for strips of dried venison they had saved from the early, innocent days. They stole handfuls of hardtack from the kitchen stores, a single biscuit at a time. Elias had a compass, a precious relic from his journey in, and another man had a flint and steel. It was a pathetic arsenal against the Alaskan wilderness, a suicide mission by any rational measure, but it was better than waiting for their turn on Braddock's blood-stained table. When the storm finally hit, a raging, white tempest of wind and snow that shook the cabins to their foundations, they moved. 9 shadows slipped out of their bunkhouses at staggered intervals, melting one by one into the white chaos. They left behind the deceptive warmth of the fires, the cloying smell of the cookhouse, and the monstrous, orderly hell of Camp 17. Their immediate goal was not justice or retribution. It was simply to survive the night. They ran. 9 ghosts fleeing a graveyard, propelled not just by the fear of Harker and his killers, but by the weight of the 112 souls they were leaving behind. The flight of the 9 men was not an escape from hell, but a desperate, lateral plunge into a different circle of it. The Alaskan wilderness, in the heart of a blizzard, is an impartial, indiscriminate, and patient killer. For 17 days that felt like 17 years, they battled the storm and their own gnawing hunger, their journey a waking nightmare painted in shades of white snow, black frostbite, and the ever-present, crimson memory of the faces they had left behind. They were hunted not by men, but by the wind, which tore at their clothes and stole the breath from their lungs, by the cold, which seeped into their bones and turned their thoughts to sluggish, frozen things, and by the terrifying, paranoid belief that Harker's enforcers were somehow tracking them, shadows moving just beyond the veil of the blinding storm. Of the 9 who fled into that white abyss, only 4 would emerge on the other side. The other 5 were reclaimed by the wilderness, their bodies becoming silent, frozen monuments to their desperate bid for freedom. The 4 who survived, including a hollowed-out Elias and the old, resilient Irishman Finn, would ultimately stumble into a remote trading post, their bodies emaciated, their eyes ancient, their minds forever scarred by a horror for which the human language has no adequate words. Back at Camp 17, their absence was discovered at dawn. For Grant Harker, this was not a simple escape of frightened men. It was a breach of protocol, a critical flaw in his perfect closed system. The escape of 9 assets was a significant logistical loss, but the escape of the clerk, the record keeper who had seen the red journal, was a direct threat to the philosophical and operational integrity of his entire enterprise. He sent his inner circle, Corley, Monroe, and Stennis out into a fading storm with rifles and grim resolve. Their mission was not to bring the fugitives back, but to erase the error, to balance the ledger in blood and silence. But the hunters returned days later, empty-handed, their own faces etched with a new and unfamiliar kind of fear, the fear of failure, and of the vast, unforgiving wilderness that had swallowed their quarry. With the escape of the nine, the delicate, brutal equilibrium of Camp 17 shattered completely. The system Harker had so meticulously constructed was predicated on a steady, predictable supply of the weak to feed and empower the strong. Now, that supply was gone. The remaining men were all predators, all survivors, all members of the inner circle who had bought their status with complicity. The very foundation of their society, the shared secret, the grim camaraderie of the feast began to crumble, replaced by a gnawing, primal paranoia. The hunters, having failed to find their prey outside the camp, began to look for it within. Harker's cold, dispassionate logic, once their shield and their justification, now became an inescapable cage. His system, so perfectly designed to eliminate the weak, had no protocol for a scenario where only the strong, the ruthless, and the hungry remained. The mathematics of the flesh, in its terrible and immutable logic, began to demand new sacrifices from its own priesthood. The collapse was swift, savage, and inevitable. It began not with a bang, but with a whispered accusation of hoarding, a sideways glance of suspicion. Monroe, the quiet hunter, was the first of the inner circle to be decommissioned. His death framed as a tragic accident during a solo hunt for game that no longer existed. His portion was shared among the others in a tense, silent meal that lacked any pretense of ceremony or camaraderie. It was just meat. Then Corley, the brute, fueled by fear and a growing madness, challenged Harker's authority directly. The confrontation was not one of words or ideology, but of brutal, primitive violence that ended with Corley's body being dragged to the cookhouse. The precise, horrifying details of what happened in those final, cannibalistic weeks are lost to history. A story told only by the axe marks on the cabin walls, the bloodstains on the frozen earth, and the splintered human bones scattered amongst the wood shavings. Harker's perfect, logical order devoured itself, a serpent eating its own tail, until the very concept of strength and weakness became meaningless in a maelstrom of pure, animalistic survival. When the North Pine Timber Company's relief party, led by a pragmatic foreman named Hayes, finally broke through the spring thaw in late April, they did not find a bustling, productive logging camp. They found a ghost town suspended in a silent, icy tableau of decay. They found the profound, unnerving silence of a graveyard. The cabins were empty, their doors swinging on frozen hinges, creaking in the wind. They found scattered tools, a few gnawed bones picked clean by scavengers, and in Harker's cabin, a neatly kept ledger detailing timber yields that abruptly, chillingly, ended in mid-February. Of the 121 men who had walked into the valley, there was almost no physical sign. The official report, filed with the territorial authorities after a cursory investigation, cited a catastrophic outbreak of a virulent form of dysentery, compounded by mass desertion in the face of starvation. It was a plausible, clean, and financially manageable explanation that required no further questions. The company sealed the records, wrote off the losses, and North Pine Basin was erased from their operational maps. Its name and its story redefined, redesigned, and ultimately reduced to a tragic but unremarkable footnote in the brutal, ledger-driven history of the frontier. The camp itself was left to be reclaimed by the forest, its terrible secrets buried under a blanket of pine needles, wild moss, and decades of willful, corporate forgetting. The four survivors did not speak of what they had seen. How could they? What words could possibly contain the truth? They sold a fabricated tale of getting lost during a hunt and surviving a brutal winter for a pittance. Just enough money to buy new clothes and a train ticket south. And then they vanished, melting into the great, anonymous tide of nameless, faceless men seeking a new life, a new name, a new past in the burgeoning American West. Finn, the old Irishman, died of pneumonia in a charity ward in a San Francisco boarding house 2 years later. His final days spent in delirious, tormented whispers about a red leather book and the taste of sausage. The other two were never heard from again, swallowed by the silence they had chosen. Only Elias Vaughan held on to the truth, a poison and a penance he would carry for the rest of his life. Before they parted ways for the last time, under the shadow of a giant sequoia in the California wilderness, he took the copied pages, the damning testament of Harker's protocol, and sealed them in a tin box he had bought for the purpose. He buried the box at the base of the ancient tree, marking the spot with a single hammered nail, a final, secret period to the story. And then he walked away, never looking back. He took a new name, found work as a quiet, unassuming accountant in a small, dusty town, and for 40 years, he lived a life of profound, monastic silence. The screams of Camp 17 locked away in the deepest, coldest vault of his memory. The haunting legacy of Camp 17, however, did not die with its survivors or get buried in the Alaskan permafrost. It lay dormant, a seed of truth waiting for the slightest crack of light. In 1911, a tenacious federal investigator looking into financial misconduct at a powerful railroad conglomerate stumbled upon a dusty crate of sealed corporate records from the long-defunct North Pine Timber Company. Inside was a single, thin file labeled North Pine Basin, 1875, asset loss. But what disturbed the investigator was not the file itself, but what was tucked inside it, a weathered, mud-caked tin box containing dozens of handwritten pages, signed simply E.V. None of the current corporate officials could explain its presence. It was a ghost in their machine. The file was deemed irrelevant to the financial investigation and was sealed once more. Its contents a lingering, unanswered question in a government archive. But a secret, once written, has a life of its own. It seeks the light. A single copy of those pages was surreptitiously made by a curious clerk and, years later, leaked to a local reporter in Anchorage. The reporter, a man who understood the power of corporate interests and the fragility of his own career, never published the story. But he couldn't bring himself to destroy it. He kept the pages, and when he died, his daughter, sorting through his effects, passed them on to a tenacious regional historian named Margaret Albright. Her meticulously researched but sparsely read essay, Camp 17 and the Mathematics of the Flesh, was published in a small, obscure academic journal in 1958. Few read it, fewer still believed it, dismissing it as macabre folklore. But a copy still exists, buried deep within a university library archive, filed under the blandly academic heading Disputed Histories of the Alaskan Frontier. It remains a secret, hidden in plain sight, a truth waiting for a voice. And so, we are left in the quiet, echoing aftermath of a scream that has reverberated for over a century. The story of Camp 17 forces us to confront a deeply unsettling question, one that probes the very bedrock of our own assumed morality. How thin is the veneer of civilization we wear? How quickly can the rules of society, the ethics of humanity that we hold so dear, be stripped away by the cold, the hunger, and the seductive, brutal logic of absolute survival? Grant Harker's Red Journal was not the diary of a madman. It was the prospectus of a man who believed he had transcended conventional morality to discover a more honest, more efficient way of being. He saw our shared humanity not as a guiding star, but as a burdensome luxury, an inefficient variable in the equation of existence, and in the frozen, godless isolation of his kingdom. He traded it for order. In the end, This is a story about the enduring, almost spiritual power of a single voice against the crushing, institutional silence of history. The 112 men who were consumed by the winter of 1875 were erased from the ledgers of the living. Their names were struck, their contracts terminated, their memory buried by a convenient corporate lie. But they were not entirely forgotten, because one man, a quiet bookkeeper who believed in the sanctity of the record, refused to let the numbers lie. His act of writing, of secretly copying those terrible pages in the dead of night, was not an act of heroism in the moment, but an act of profound, desperate faith that a truth, once recorded, can outlast the men who tried to bury it, the companies that tried to seal it, and the years that tried to erode it. His copied pages are a testament that even in the face of absolute, soul-destroying horror, the simple act of bearing witness is a powerful form of resistance. It is a refusal to be silent. The essay by Margaret Albright contains a quote from the final page of Elias Vaughan's copied manuscript, a line written by a man who had lived in silence for 4 decades. A final balancing of his own life's ledger. "If survival means silence," he wrote, "then let me speak, let me scream. And now, all these years later, you have heard him. The question that remains, the one that lingers in the cold air long after the story is told, is how many other screams are still locked away in the archives of our history, filed under disputed, just waiting for someone to be brave enough to listen."